Welcome to our first Open Academy webinar, where we will have a conversation about Holocaust remembrance at a time of rising anti-Semitism. Before I say anything further, let me express my condolences to David and our American friends who are watching tonight for the tragic accident at Ronald Reagan Airport last night. Our hearts go out to you and all those who are suffering today. We will continue on an equally sobering note today, speaking about Holocaust remembrance. This year, of course, marks the 20th anniversary of the UNGA Resolution 60/7, which called for an International Day of Remembrance for the victims of the Holocaust. Still, while Holocaust remembrance has been institutionalized, at least in Europe, anti-Semitism has never been more widespread. Why is this? With me in this launch edition of the Open Academy, we have David Harris, legendary American Jewish leader of the American Jewish Committee, AJC, for over 30 years, and is today the executive vice chair of the Institute of the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. I hope I got both the numbers and the names right there, David. As ECI, we count ourselves lucky to have had David participate in a number of our events over the years, and he has also become something of a mentor and an inspiration for many of us. David, usually when we meet, we do so over lunch in New York at your favorite restaurant, and we speak very openly off the record. Today, needless to say, we are on the record, but I think it will be equally interesting. By the way, my name is Tomas Sandell. I'm the founding director of the European Coalition for Israel. But David, how about you? I know in the Jewish world you do not need an introduction, but for many of the viewers here who come from a different faith tradition, they may be asking themselves, who is David Harris? In your own words, who is David Harris?
First of all, Thomas, thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for your leadership, and thank you to the European Coalition for Israel, which plays such an increasingly important part on the European and global stage. How to describe myself, perhaps most relevant to this conversation, is that I'm the first person in my entire extended family born in the United States. My mother was born in Moscow. They fled Bolshevism when she was 6. They moved to France. She went to schooling in France until 1940, when the Nazis occupied France, and then spent the next 17 months with her family, escaping, hiding, desperately seeking a visa anywhere outside of Europe, finding it virtually impossible. My father was born in Budapest, Hungary, grew up in Vienna, was expelled from the university in 1938 after the Anschluss, and then fled Austria for France, served in the French Foreign Legion, was imprisoned by Vichy, given special regime as a Jew, escaped on his second attempt from the camp after 3 years, and spent the remainder of the wartime in OSS, which was the American espionage agency, operating behind Nazi lines. OSS brought him to the United States after the Second World War. My parents married here. I was born here. And my whole life has largely been devoted to trying to understand what happened to them and to the other members of my family, including later my wife, who came from an Arab country. And what is it about the Jews that requires permanent explanation and defense?
That was an amazing synopsis of your life, and perhaps I can do have a commercial break here and to say if you want to hear more about or read more about David's life, you can Google and get a copy of this book, which is On the Front Lines, Lifetime of Global Jewish Advocacy, David Harris in conversation with Agnieszka Markiewicz. There you will hear even more detailed description of David's, not only David's fascinating life, but also that of his parents. We mentioned that you were the head of AJC for many years. By Shimon Peres, you've been called the foreign minister of the Jewish people. I'm sure there are many foreign ministers who are a bit envious of your description on that one. Have you changed your tone after leaving AJC? Are you more outspoken today? The reason I ask you this is that as advocates, we have to always balance how we say things, considering that the people that we sometimes would like to criticize, we also need to remain in dialogue with them. Are you more upfront today? I'm reading your tweets on a regular basis, and for me, that's a slightly different version of David Harris, the David Harris I knew for many years. Is that a correct observation, or is it an expression of life after October 7th?
I think it's a combination of everything you just said, Thomas. I'd like to think I've always been very clear and outspoken in my defense of Israel, in my opposition to anti-Semitism, in my attempt to help protect the integrity of Holocaust memory. I recall, for example, it was over 10 years ago, so I was still very, very much involved with AJC, that I was invited to speak at Mauthausen, the infamous Nazi camp in Austria. And the four speakers before me were the president of Austria, the president of Hungary, the president of Poland, and the chairman of the Russian Duma, the Russian parliament. I was the fifth speaker. And all four spoke about dead Jews, referencing the victims of Mauthausen. Not one spoke about living Jews. Not one mentioned the word Israel. So if you're asking about outspokenness, I stood up in front of them and the 1,000 other officials and ambassadors and dignitaries and survivors without any speech, without any prepared speech. And I said, this is unacceptable. We are witnessing increasing anti-Semitism in the world. Once again, this was, again, over 10 years ago. And if you're not willing to stand up and defend and protect the right of living Jews, then forgive me, what's the point of mourning dead Jews? We cannot bring them back. No matter what we say, how we mourn, the prayers we express, Thomas, nothing will bring back 2/3 of European Jewry, the 6 million who perished. And also, if you don't understand the meaning of Israel, I mean the deeper, more metaphysical meaning of Israel, not just Israel as a political hobby that on a daily basis you either support or criticize, but the deeper meaning of Israel when my parents and millions of other Jews who were trapped in Europe before Auschwitz was built, when Hitler was teasing the world and saying, you care so much about the Jews? Bitte, take them. I'm talking 1935, 36, 37, 38. Take them. And how many took them, Thomas? How many? Had there been an Israel in 1938, had there been Israeli embassies and consulates across Europe, when people like my parents were literally trapped with nowhere to go, how would history have looked different? how the Jewish people have looked different. So maybe today I'm even more outspoken, maybe a little less nuanced diplomatically, but the passion and, frankly, if I may say it, the anger have always been there. The challenge for me has always been how to channel the anger into constructive advocacy. And that was a challenge 30 years ago, and it remains a challenge in our post-October 7th world.
Well, I think, David, if anyone has mastered that task, and that's why I posed the question that way, because I read some of the comments also to your books, and people always say that there's no one who is more articulate and in explaining the Jewish cause than David Harris, but they always say it with such a nice way. Did you ever have any enemies? Anyone who said, "Listen, this is unacceptable. You're going too far. You can't offend us. You can't speak like that on a solemn event." You don't have to mention names. Don't worry.
No. I mean, in Mauthausen, for example, I mean, again, I'm speaking shorthand here, Thomas, on this ECI call. I always thought that I knew where the boundaries were in terms of what one should say on an occasion and how one can say it. There are various ways of expressing oneself. In no way would I have accused people in front of me they were not responsible for the Holocaust. My goal rather was to try and help educate, if you will, or illuminate the fact that as grateful as I am that they would come to a memorial event at Mauthausen or any other such camp, most recently Auschwitz a few days ago, unless we're willing to speak about living Jews and the increasingly serious threats to Jewish life today in much of Europe, in North America, in Australia, and elsewhere, then then we're missing the point. Mm. And if Israel is only a political punching bag, that only when Israel, so to speak, behaves the way a European country is supposed to behave, only then is it worthy of praise. But when it seeks to defend itself against a genocidal enemy that openly and repeatedly calls for the murder of Jews and says we will repeat October 7th again and again and again, then I, as a Jew and as a human being, cannot remain silent. I mean, Thomas, how can I?
So yeah.
So please.
So you would agree that there is a contradiction that this year will mark the 20th anniversary of this UNGA resolution, meaning that there have been for 20 years there have been Holocaust memorials basically in every European capital, including in Auschwitz, with very prominent guests, and anti-Semitism has never been more widespread. How do you explain that?
I think it will take more than the time we have for this ECI seminar. And I think it will take more skills than at least I have, because the answer is not just a simple common sense answer. I think it goes deep into psychology and religion and theology and faith and many other areas where I may not be the most knowledgeable person. I think, for one thing, for Europe, and I'm generalizing, obviously, Thomas, and there are always risks in generalization, but Europe, and I've been a big fan of the European project from the time of Jean Monnet, from the time of Foreign Minister Robert Schuman. So please understand in that context. And I'm also an EU citizen. I'm a citizen of Austria. My wife is a citizen of Italy. So Europe for me is not some detached entity across an ocean. But Europe can still not explain to itself the Europe of the Enlightenment, the Europe of the European project, the Europe of the advances, the remarkable post-war advances in democracy, in integration, in celebration of the noblest human values. Europe cannot explain to itself the permanent scar of the Shoah. And let's be clear, while there was anti-Semitism elsewhere in the world, most notably in the Muslim world, over centuries, the Holocaust was unique. And it was not a few, it was many. And it was not just Germany. There were many complicit and many in collaboration. And beyond that concentric circle, there were even more who averted their eyes, whether through indifference, through neutrality. How does Europe explain this to itself? How can the home of the Enlightenment, how can the home of European integration of the 27, how can Europe, which often, especially in comparison to the United States, uh, evokes, we are the space with no capital punishment. We are the space with moral enlightenment. We are the home of advanced soft power. How do you explain the Shoah? So when Israel suddenly has an army, the IDF, and defends itself, and wars are never clean. Only those on the outside of wars can pretend wars are clean. Wars are dirty. Wars are dirty. There are casualties in war. Innocent people are caught up. There is damage and destruction. Too many in Europe now say, aha, look at the Jews. The moment they have an army, the moment they have power of any sort, they act no differently than the Nazis. This kind of moral inversion. And by saying this, what Europe, or those Europeans are saying is, we're in a sense, we're exonerating ourselves. Because you see, the Jews had this moral claim on us after 1945. But no. When we compare the Gaza Strip to the Warsaw Ghetto, as some have, or when we compare the IDF to the Wehrmacht, or when we dress Shimon Peres or Ariel Sharon or other Israeli leaders in Nazi uniforms and put a little mustache here, what we're really saying is, you see, you're no different.
Mm.
So I can go on and go in other directions as well, but the point is very simple, Thomas. When Jews are victims, they're mourned. When Jews once again become actors on the global stage, and in this case, live in a part of the world which, unlike Scandinavia for so many years, doesn't operate by Scandinavian Lutheran rules. When Israel lives alongside people who celebrate death, something which the West has great difficulty understanding. When Israel faces enemies that pursue bloodlust, a bloodthirstiness that's almost inconceivable for a Westerner to understand. Maybe they can understand war, territorial war over land, but how to understand the murder of babies, the murder of pregnant women, the kidnapping of people in their 80s who are survivors of the Holocaust? How can a Westerner understand this? So some tried to suggest that this is a valid form of, quote, resistance. But at the end of the day, is it that, or is it that those being attacked are Jews, and somehow Jews are exempt from the rules of humanity? And when we're victims, maybe we deserve to be victims.
Yeah. So basically, you agree with me that there's something with Holocaust education and Holocaust memorials that has not really connect the dots, because there is a generalization of suffering as such, and you can attend many Holocaust memorial, never hear the word Jewish or Jew, um, but even more so, the connection with Israel is non-existing. That's like, I think every speechwriter will make sure that your elected leader does not say anything about Israel. And for me, this is it's a great problem. I have mentioned to my ECI audience a number of times that at one of the Holocaust memorials in in Brussels, and I'm not going to mention names, but a very senior EU official, I was introduced to him as European Coalition for Israel, and he said, "And what does Israel has to do with any of this?" So yes, you can speak, as you say, about the Jews. That's legitimate and an honorable things to do, but don't bring in Israel. So there is a problem, and I think it's time that we do address this issue 20 years on with the Holocaust memorials. Coming back, David, to something which also can be a misunderstanding, and that is when we today look then at Israel, and people would say, yes, Holocaust was terrible, but why does the Palestinians have to pay the price? And this is based on the logic that Israel was given to the Jewish people after the Holocaust in some sort of compensation or guilt. We, as you know, as an organization, has spoken a lot about pledges that were made to the Jewish people much earlier. And as you rightly said, if those pledges had been met, say in 1938, millions of your comrades of Jews would be alive today. Do you think that we as pro-Israel advocates have done enough, or have we done a good enough job to explain the legal foundation of Israel? Then going back to Sanremo, going back to the long connection between the people and the land, and also here have a good book to recommend. I'm not sure if you have seen this. I picked it up when I was in New York. It's on settler colonialism, ideology, violence, and justice, which debunks this idea that the Jews who came to Israel were somehow colonizers, European imperialists. And I think it's an important book, and it's an important argument to start using much more. What are your thoughts on, away from the Holocaust for a few moments, but looking at the say the raison d'être of the Jewish state? Can we do more? Can we strengthen the foundations?
Thomas, it's an important question. I don't think it has a simple answer. I recall a meeting with a foreign minister, actually of a European country. I won't name the country, where he opened the meeting, he thought very magnanimously, by saying, "Mr. Harris, I want you to know that my country supports the right of Israel to exist." And getting back to your earlier question about candor, I turned to him without any diplomatic filter that might have otherwise stopped me, and I said, "And Mr. Minister, I want you to know that my organization recognizes your country's right to exist." And he was momentarily stunned. And then I said, as politely as I could, May we proceed now to the agenda. I don't know, with a possible exception, Thomas, of Taiwan, I don't know of another country on the planet, certainly in the ranks of the United Nations, where Taiwan is not a member, but Israel is. I don't know of another country on earth that is called on to keep defending and justifying and explaining its right to exist. And I don't know why we should fall into the trap of being put in a way in the courtroom. Israel is a fact. It's a fact of life. It has been since 1948. If one wants to be honest, it's a fact of life for 4,000 years. And when it was not a fact of life, it was not because Jews abandoned the idea, but because the Jews were forcibly removed from what became a center of the political universe. So if we're going to talk about legitimacy, I can ask as an American, what exactly is the legitimacy of the United States of America? What is the equivalent? You mentioned the League of Nations, you mentioned San Remo, we can mention the United Nations Partition Plan. What exactly are the equivalents that legitimize the United States of America, or Canada, or Australia, or New Zealand? What explains why in my dozens of trips to Latin America over many years, with very few exceptions that I can count on one hand, every leader I met with was a white European whose family had somehow migrated, colonized, choose your word, settled. Let me go further. What explains the, quote, legitimacy of Lebanon, of Syria? My wife was born and raised in Libya. We think of Libya as an Arab country, but Arabs came from the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, some 1,500 or 2,000 kilometers away, to invade, to occupy, to colonize, to settle, to control Libya to this day. The indigenous people were Berbers. And by the way, the Jews arrived in Libya, thanks to the Romans, centuries before. So, Thomas, the fact of the matter is, we can have seminars, we can issue pamphlets, ECI, other groups. Very few people are going to read them, much less be convinced. My point, Israel is a fact of life. Live with it, because Israel's going nowhere. It is a member of the United Nations. It has been since 1949. And if we want to get into the legitimacy debate, I'm not going to spend my time defending Israel's legitimacy. I'm going to be challenging yours.
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting point. And I mentioned earlier that our discussions in New York usually are off the record. I take a chance of quoting you. You can stop me because you said, Thomas, you said, listen, I've done this advocacy for X amount of years. I always thought that the moral argument, the ethical argument, just to explain that, what is morally right would be convincing. And you said, listen, that's not the case. It's all about national interest. You have to, like you just did, you have to explain for the nations what's in it for them, be it security, be it innovation, cybersecurity, whatever. And that really opened my eyes in a new way, because we tend to think that people are very rational, and if they only knew their history better or international law, they would agree with us. But it's not that simple. So thank you for raising that point again. Let me move to EU Israel relations, or how EU is dealing with the issue of anti-Semitism. You've been around longer than I have, and as you say, you're an EU citizen as well, and I think that's worth taking note of. When you look at EU Israel relations today, and slash how EU is dealing with its anti-Semitism. Are you hopeful? I mean, we're talking about a career of 30 years. Um, is the EU doing the right thing? Are we moving in the right direction?
I think the short answer has to be no. There are many well-intentioned people. I don't want to start listing them, but there are, and I would begin with people like Ursula von der Leyen, um, whom I knew when she was a German politician before she came to Brussels, and since. These are very well-intentioned people. I don't question that. Not everyone is as well-intentioned, but there are many well-intentioned people who understand that the Jews in Europe are in a way a litmus test of Europe's fulfillment of its own highest values, particularly since the European project began. And the fact that anti-Semitism has been rising in most European countries since October the 7th in places like Britain and France are sky high, perhaps unprecedented since the Second World War. The fact that according to EU polling, any number of Jews in Europe are considering leaving or questioning their future suggests to me, Thomas, that whatever has been attempted until now, and people like Katharina von Schnurbein on behalf of the European Union, Felix Klein in Germany, John Mann in Britain, and others who are mandated to deal with anti-Semitism and are trying their very best, ultimately are losing the race against time. Now, why is this? And I think because in some respects it comes back to your earlier point. The Jews are a moral test, but there are other considerations that operate in a way against this moral test. Changing demography in Europe is a big one. It's one that most people don't want to discuss in public because it's very difficult to navigate the subject linguistically without immediately being called a fascist, extreme right wing, an Islamophobe. But the changing demography in much of Europe, particularly Western European countries, Sweden, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Germany, uh, uh, Britain, Ireland, it is changing the kind of calculus. Well, if we support the Jews, is there a downside? Is there a cost? There could be a political cost. There could be an electoral cost. And after all, in a democracy, the goal of the exercise, apart from talking about noble values, is to get oneself elected and reelected and reelected. So, one big issue facing Europe is changing demography. And when every European country, I believe, every single one has a negative birth rate, and the only solution is either to watch countries shrink in population or invite immigration, much of which is coming from North Africa and the Middle East, and some of which, not all, but some of which is coming while resistant to integration, at least on European terms. A huge challenge. And then, Thomas, the more this migration changes the face of many European countries, the stronger the extreme right wing becomes as a reaction to the challenge to nationalism, to culture, to identity. So the far right, generally speaking, is no friend of the Jews either. And then you have the third piece of the story, call them the extreme left wing, the neo-Marxists, the Jeremy Corbynistas, if you will. And then you see these strange alliances between the Reds and the Greens. And often the only thing that these three extreme groups have in common is a hatred for the Jews, a hatred for Israel, or a hatred for Zionism, or a hatred for the Jews, or some combination. And of course, the Holocaust is seen through this prism as a negative force, because the Holocaust is seen as a tragedy that evokes sympathy for the Jews, and maybe even sympathy for the state of Israel. So how do we, these extreme forces of the extreme left, the extreme right, and the jihadist forces, how do we diminish the power of the Holocaust on the imagination of European culture, European society, European individuals, as part of the strategy to diminish, downgrade, isolate the remaining Jews in Europe, and by extension, the connection to Israel?
So
Huge challenge for Europe.
yeah.
And I don't, Thomas, I'd love to be optimistic. Americans by nature tend to be optimistic. I was raised by an optimistic Hollywood in the 1950s and 60s, where all the TV programs had a happy ending. That changed, but that was my childhood. But where is the happy ending here for the remaining Jews of Ireland, when the president of Ireland has become, in effect, a spokesperson for all of Israel's enemies? And where on Holocaust Remembrance Day in Dublin, he instrumentalized the event to turn it against Israel. And when some people in the audience protested, the participants in this seminar may have seen, they were dragged out of the Holocaust Remembrance event. Or how can the government of Spain, after a genocidal attack on October 7th against Israel, decide that this is the perfect time for Spain to recognize a so-called independent Palestinian state? I mean, this is insanity.
And
These
you
are
can, of course,
EU member states.
yeah, you can, of course, add Norway to that
Yeah,
list.
absolutely. Absolutely. So what's going on here?
Yeah.
Is it really conceivable that the leadership of Spain, which, by the way, rejects independence for Catalonia, and which to this day will not recognize the independence of Kosovo, which has been recognized by well over 100 countries, nonetheless is willing to extend sovereign recognition to a non-existent state of Palestine, in what, at least at the moment, Thomas, and not everything in life is black and white. I understand totally the importance of nuance in discussions, but the Hamas attack on Israel on October the 7th was as close to a good versus evil moment in history as anything I know. It was no different for me than the Nazi attack on Poland, September 1st, 1939, the Japanese attack on the United States, December 7th, 1941. And as far as I'm concerned, there is no third way. Either one understands and stands with Israel. That does not mean endorsing every action, every statement by every Israeli at every moment in time. But, I don't mean to cheapen the analogy, but in the World Cup final of soccer, there were two teams. You root for one team, you root for the other team. You can't root for both teams. You can't divide it. You have a democracy that left Gaza in 2005 and gave the people there their first chance in history. The Egyptians did not, the Ottoman Turks did not, to govern themselves. They had models they could have followed. Singapore, Dubai, Abu Dhabi. They chose a different model. The model of channeling all aid into seeking the destruction of the state of Israel. So you have Israel on the one hand and Hamas, the most regressive force on earth, being supported by so-called progressives in a good versus evil battle. What's happened here?
So let me challenge you, David, a little bit.
Sure.
Before I do that, let's just debunk another myth related to anti-Semitism. We often say, more education, more democracy, strengthen democracy. Well, the Germans were very educated. When we look at demography, it means exactly what you say if we translate it in saying that those that need to be elected and are looking at the constituencies will have to make these calculations. And it takes a lot for a candidate to a political in a political party to stand for the right thing, knowing that he will not be elected. That's political suicide. So democracy, when you have Anti-Defamation League, who came out with statistics showing how anti-Semitic, especially people under 35, are. If you translate that into political influence, the future looks grim. But coming back to who are our friends, I wrote an op-ed some time ago where I said a little bit provocatively that Jews may soon have a situation where there are two groups of people, those that don't want anything to do with the Jewish population and are clearly their enemies, and the others that the Jewish communities don't want anything to do with. So the center becomes very thin and slim and hard to define. But jokes apart, you see what I'm hinting at. We have a situation today in Europe with right-wing populism, some different expressions: hard right, extreme right, populist right. We have personalities like Prime Minister Meloni. There are Orban. There are others. As we speak, the big discussion is the elections in Germany. But what would you, maybe to come back to this question? Clearly, there is anti-Semitism on the extreme right, the extreme left, and imported anti-Semitism. But as we relate to, say, the ECR group in the European Parliament today, conservative and reformist, at one point in time, they were a group non grata for the Israeli state. For the moment, there is another group. How would you navigate? Jokes apart, it's difficult and it's a very complex question. But I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Sure. First of all, on the narrowing space that you said at the beginning, Thomas, I agree. On the other hand, I do think, and maybe it's not just wishful thinking, that there are more people who are waking up to the threats and who are understanding that, as has been said throughout history, the Jews are only the beginning of the story. They're not the end of the story. When Jews are attacked, democracy is threatened, coexistence is threatened. Case in point, one of many. When ISIS flexed its muscles in Libya some years ago, you may remember the image of Christians who were on their knees, blindfolded, while I think his name was Jihadi John, with a big sword or machete, was about to behead all of them, which happened. Now, I mentioned my wife was from Libya, but by 1967, there was not a single Jew left in Libya. They had either fled or been killed as Jews. When ISIS came along, there were no Jews, but that was not the end of the story. The Saturday people, as we are sometimes called, were gone. The next targets were the Sunday people. You, the people of Christian faith. And I also think that there are some, I wish there were more, but there are some Muslims who themselves understand that the interpretation of the faith by the Iranian revolutionary regime or by the Houthis or by Hezbollah or by Hamas or Islamic Jihad or the Taliban or ISIS is a kidnapping of the faith. And that these moderate Muslims, centered, for example, in countries like the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco, they need to stand up as well, not first and foremost because of the Jews, but because this is being done in their name. When Allahu Akbar is shouted and then a bomb is set off or a child is kidnapped, it is in the name of Allah. Is that the understanding of Allah and the tenets of Islam? So I don't want to overstate it, Thomas, but every moment in time, we're speaking at a moment in time, is not a permanent moment in time. It's a fluid moment in time. And so what may be in 6 months or 6 years can look very different than today. And I want to believe that more and more people will begin to understand the nature of Hamas, the nature of the Taliban, where today in Afghanistan, women, young girls, are not even allowed to speak in public, much less to sing, much less to be seen. Nothing to do with Jews, but everything to do with the way that we wish to live our lives. And so that's the first point. And I think, for me, a very important point, there are allies. They may be different than before October 7th. And we shouldn't be frozen in time or place. The second point about the right, I'm writing a book, almost finished, for Oxford University Press on anti-Semitism. And I deal with this question that you raise, although I want the participants to know that we did not discuss questions beforehand. Not at all. This is spontaneous. And I think we now have to distinguish, from a Jewish perspective, two schools within the far right, or the right. One are those that are trying very hard to repair their relationship with the Jews, or perhaps write a new chapter. Now, whether Jews are ready to believe this is debatable. Some are, some are not. But here I would cite Giorgia Meloni in Italy, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, Marine Le Pen in France. Again, you'll see in those countries some Jews saying, we accept the change, we believe they're sincere, we endorse, we support, and other Jews saying, no, not so fast. We have our doubts, we have our suspicions. So you have, but that group on the one hand versus a second group that is hard and fast, neo-Nazi, nostalgic, in defense of the Nazi era, and who neither seek approval from Jews nor want it. So I think we need to be sophisticated enough, whether at ECI or in Jewish organizations, to say, well, wait a second, they're not all in one category requiring one response. They're in now different categories. And we need to at least listen to what Giorgia Meloni says, pay serious attention to it, perhaps meet with her aides, and then make a determination for ourselves. Is this credible? Do we believe it? Do the Jews in Italy believe it? Does the Israeli ambassador in Rome believe it? And maybe we need to change our thinking a little bit, or alternatively, no. It's the same old, it may be a different recipe, but it's the same old grandmother's stew. I didn't like it then. I don't like it today.
Well, that's a very good answer, and maybe we should mention what you did. That this is completely unscripted. I didn't send you. I asked you if you wanted some questions beforehand. You said not at all. Surprise me, which I hope I have done.
Yes,
Which
keep
lead
doing it.
us to the grand finale. You have something very important to do in 5 minutes, to go and pick up your grandchildren who are not going to wait. So I'm just going to allow myself one last question. And that has to do with ECI. You know us by now. Interestingly, I am preparing for this webinar. I recall, I think the first time we met was in Brussels, and I was to meet with the whole board of AJC, and you all looked at me, not really knowing what to make out of this fin, and you asked, "So why are you doing this?" And I remember I thought, what on earth how can I answer this question? And I recall I said, well, it's very simple for me. Going back to the scriptures, I want to be my brother's keeper. And later on, 10, 15 years later, we took this I am my brother's keeper as something that we repeat not only during Holocaust Remembrance Day, but throughout the year as a description of who we are. But assume for a second that we would recruit you, David, as the new CEO of ECI. What would you do first week of office? I'm referring to Trump, who did some very radical things. But we're listening, how could we become the best possible friends of the Jewish people and the state of Israel?
Oh, there's a surprise question. And I've always learned, Thomas, the last question is often the most challenging of all. So you saved it for the end. But it's a great question. And look, it's not for me to suggest to ECI, which you founded, bless you for doing it, and which you've helped sustain and build, and this wonderful group that's on this call that I hope one day to meet in person, rather than through technology alone. But I think, to begin with, it's to return to the point I just made a moment ago. We have more potential friends, or quiet friends, or unannounced friends than we may think. And if I were sitting in the ECI war room, so to speak, I would be canvassing throughout Europe. Who have we somehow missed? Who are the people we haven't reached out to? Who are the groups that are potential allies of ours, partners? And I think there are quite a few. Each country may be a little different. In one country, it could be the Kurdish minority. In another country, it could be a strong Christian community that you haven't yet engaged. Secondly, I think there may be, at least in some places where ECI is known, still a certain, what shall I say, confusion. Is ECI a Christian organization motivated by Christian theology, or motivated by the Hebrew scripture of I am my brother's keeper, or somewhere in between? I think that to the extent that it is driven by Christian theology, it will naturally attract one audience, but perhaps not another audience. I think that a number of people who might flirt with ECI might want to know more, Thomas, if I may speak as a friend, about what exactly is it? Is it theologically driven? Is it inspired by a kind of post-World War II Yad Vashem, righteous among the Gentiles? You are the modern day Jan Karski, Irina Sendler, those who reached out to the Jews, whether for secular or religious reasons. Number three, I think any successful advocacy organization today must have a top-notch communication strategy. The old-fashioned way, in-person meetings, long footnoted pamphlets and books will not work with more and more of the audiences. So is ECI doing enough, or could it be doing more in the social media space? Is it reaching people the way people want to be reached for information? Is it talking in the language that they want to hear? Is it imparting information in ways that they will grasp today? All of which are extremely different than, I'm older than you, but when we were both younger. And without that, I think we're largely talking to ourselves. So again, I can keep going, but I know our time is short. But I would start with, who are the people we aren't yet reaching, who we should be reaching? How do we clarify more clearly for everyone whatever ambiguity or uncertainty there is about what motivates us? And do we have the right communication strategy for the year 2025? I mean, I look, Thomas, at some of our older advocates who are so proud that they reached 10,000 followers on Twitter or X, or have 5,000 followers on Facebook. And then I see an athlete, an actor, with millions, if not tens of millions. Elon Musk himself, whatever the controversy, has over 200 million followers just on X. And I realized that if any of these people, if Mbappe, the soccer player in France, or Ronaldo, were simply to say on their social media accounts, I like Israel, I support Israel, I oppose anti-Semitism, I stand with the Jewish people, that simple statement, which flies in the face of all of your years and my years of study and research and writing and speaking, will do more for our cause than almost anything else we can do. Can we reach those people? I know, for example, lots of efforts have been made to reach Messi, perhaps the world's greatest soccer player, who has been to Israel. How many others have been to Israel, have benefited from Israeli technology, or have Jewish friends but have not yet spoken out? Can we find them? Can we empower them? They could do a lot for us, Thomas.
Yeah.
A lot. So thank you for this. Thank you for ECI. Thank you for the young people you have on the seminar, which speaks about your future and our future. Mm-hmm. Thank you for the surprises.
And thank you for these last 5 minutes, which of course in a normal transaction would come with a hefty invoice, which may come later. But no, David, jokes apart, thank you for your friendship and support over many years. And you will continue to be an inspiration for us, a mentor that we look up to, and we will continue to seek your counsel. But I think we could have had no better advocate for the Jewish people at this launch edition of an open academy, which is a way to create a community and more content for our followers. And this is something that we will continue with on a regular basis, bring in other interesting voices
Good.
and have this type of a conversation. And I think that will, God willing, also be part of a social media strategy where we can reach a broader audience. David, your grandchildren are waiting for you. First thing
Yes.
first, but we thank you so much for having been generous with us to take a full hour. I'm looking forward to see you again, hopefully soon in New York, or if you come to Europe, just let us know. And may you continue to go from strength to strength also in your new position. And we need you, the Jewish people need you, and we're looking forward to continue to collaborate. So thank you. And I also say thank you to our audience. Um, Please, if you like this webinar, just feel free to share it with your friends. And we will continue to announce new seminars in the upcoming weeks, and looking forward to see you then. Thank you again, David, and thank you, everyone.